I found myself getting angry at somebody who I don't really think exists anymore. You have done this work of self-confession. This wasn't an easy book to write. It wasn't an easy book to read, but it must have been a much harder book to write because you're going through your past. This is you basically going into the confession booth, except the whole world is your priest and listing out all of your sins.
Hello, everybody out there who has tuned in to The Glenn Show. This is Glenn Loury. I teach at Brown University, and I am John Paulson Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. I'm host of The Glenn Show. And I'm joined this week by my son, Glenn Loury II, who has kindly agreed to, on the day before Father's Day, we speak here on the 15th of June, 2024, has kindly agreed to spend some time talking with his dad. So I really appreciate it. You can introduce yourself further if you like to, Glenn. I don't want to characterize you in any way that you might think would be an inadequately effusive characterization. So welcome, Glenn.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here. Hi, I'm also Glenn Loury. Don't have as long a list of credentials to introduce myself with as my dad does, but I work at a bank. I sometimes write for fun, and I'm here to talk with my dad on the eve of Father's Day about a whole bunch of things. Probably top of the list, of course, is the book that I'm going to go ahead and generously say we both feature in, your memoir. Late Admissions, which I would say I had a pretty critical editing role in.
I think that's fair to say, my son. I think that's fair to say. I'm going to ask you something about the book, but I hope we'll talk about Father's Day, fatherhood, and all those things. And that is, how did you feel about your father characterizing himself as a Black conservative?
I think it's simplest. I think your publishers did that. I don't know if I would call you a conservative, at least in what that term has come to mean in today's political landscape. Knowing you for as long as I have and as well as I do, I know you are reluctant to put yourself in any singular box, and you've taken a number of different political positions over the course of your career, a number of which I think could be classified today as quite liberal. I think, you're trying to sell a book, obviously, so you need to have some sort of hook for it. Late Admissions, Confessions from a Black Conservative, it's catchy, right? You have late admissions, so things that you are confessing later in life, and you sort of need to build yourself an audience. But I think if we're being true to who you are, I mean, you go through this in the book. You started out as a Republican for reasons that we can get into. You were sort of shunted aside by that party right when you were perhaps about to enter a different space politically. And that forced a necessary reevaluation of who you are and what you believe. And I think you consistently have reevaluated those positions. So at least in how we are defining conservatives today, there is a certain dogmatism, a certain rigidity of thought that I don't think exists with you. So I wouldn't call you a conservative. I would call you perhaps a word that you've used often to call yourself, an iconoclast. I don't always agree, but I do always think that you at least are thinking about what you believe.
That's good to hear. Let me, when asked, why do you call yourself a conservative? And you're right, the publisher did have a role in the choice of title, but, at the end of the day, it was my call. So I had to take responsibility. But whenever I'm asked about the conservative, I say, well, there are three reasons why I think of myself as conservative. One is I'm kind of a capitalism-friendly guy. I'm an economist trained in the conventional economic, pedagogy. And I believe that markets, prices, private property, profit-seeking, this kind of thing are on the whole forces for good. I mean, they're not perfect forces, and there's a lot to say that's critical, but still, I'm kind of a market-friendly, free market economist. Secondly, I used to be a born-again Christian, and I'm still kind of cultural. Some of my instincts are culturally conservative, and I kind of want to give the benefit of the doubt to some of the people who are trying to hold on to the verities. And times are changing, and I'm aware of that, but still, I'm kind of respectful of inherited views about certain cultural norms. And finally, I say, with respect to African Americans, which I write a lot about, what to do about the problems of Black people in America, I'm more of a self-help kind of personal responsibility guy than I am a reparations kind of structural racism guy. So I'm somewhat conservative in my assessment of the problems, challenges confronting African Americans. I'm somewhat culturally conservative, and I'm somewhat conservative on economic policy. I'll stop because I want to get your reaction to that.
Well, I think this is what might be dangerous about having me on the podcast, because I can speak to a lot of these things that I think are a little bit performative. I mean, especially in terms of let's talk about religion. I went to church when I was a kid, but you know who I didn't go to church with?
Me.
Yeah, you weren't there. Mom took us there for moral instruction that we ultimately stopped going to, and I told her when I was 12 that I did not believe in God. I
Can I just correct the
remember.
record a little bit? I
Yeah,
used to go and then I stopped going. It's not like I never
yes,
went.
right.
I pulled away. I pulled away while you were still a young kid.
You pulled away in part because of a loss that we suffered. Do I have this correct? Of your secretary? What's her name? Lisa?
No,
Am I
her
remembering
name is
that correct?
Sherry
Sherry.
DuPont.
Sherry DuPont.
And I tell this story in the book that we haven't really talked about yet. That's my
Yes.
memoir. We've only just mentioned it. And yeah, that was one of the reasons, but it wasn't the only reason. Not there was the cover story, and then there was the deeper truth. And I talk about that in the book, and we could talk about that here too. I just don't want us to get too far ahead of ourselves.
I know this is just a free flowing conversation here.
Well, we were talking about conservatism. I
We
mean,
were talking about conservatism,
we
and
can
I
talk
was
about whatever
talking
you want.
about. Well,
Church.
and I had a few points that I was going to go on to make here. So I'm
Okay.
talking about church because you have a credence of religion, and maybe you've come to sense that point. It's just not something that felt necessarily organic to me, given what I know of your past with religion. But if we're going to talk about conservative views,
Okay.
I mean, how much do we want to get into? Because I know you've been sensitive about talking to this in this space, your position on perhaps recent Middle Eastern military conflicts.
We can
I'm
talk
traipsed
about
around this
anything you
one
want to talk about. I'm not afraid of talking
because
about that.
I'm not afraid about people canceling me, but I do know that you have a very conservative audience that may not necessarily agree with your stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict, which I would consider, if you want to describe it, I'm going to leave the floor to you, a very liberal position.
Well, I mean, I can describe it in a word. I posted about this recently, just a couple of
Okay.
weeks ago. I had a whole, little thing I was doing about free speech and about not feeling entirely free to say what I thought. And I basically thought what's going on in Gaza is horrific. What went on October 7th was horrific. Israel had to respond in some way. They're responding in this way. It's excessive. The goal of eliminating Hamas, destroying them from the surface of earth, ensuring that nothing like October 7th can never happen again, when it's coming at the cost of tens of thousands of Palestinian lives of innocent people, of a wholesale attack of a major military industrial force against what is basically people who are huddled masses and, whatever. That's horrific. That's a price, that moral price, I wouldn't pay for the uh, objective, which is unclear how it could be achieved in any case, of quote unquote eliminating Hamas, eliminating resistance amongst the Palestinians to Israeli domination. And the cost of that is basically to drive them into the sea or to kill them all. That's not something that I can countenance. Now, I know that is a narrative about the conflict that people will dispute, including many people who were in my audience at the Glenn show, and therein lies a long conversation which is unfolding as we speak. But that's roughly it. Is that what you were referring to?
That is what I was referring to. Yeah, I was referring to what I'm going to go ahead and call a genocide
Yeah, go
of
ahead and do
people.
that.
Which I think is something that is accurate to describe any act when one group of people is trying to annihilate an entire other group of people with an overwhelming amount of force that other group cannot possibly match. And they are acting like they are justified in doing so. And there have been, definitely tragic acts that incited this, but the response is not proportionate to the cause. And if anybody
that's disputable, and the genocide word, which I've stopped short of. In my memo from a couple of weeks ago, I said that I wouldn't call it genocide, although it gets uncomfortably close to the line. But it's, I was hoping not to be in a dispute with you about the Israel-Gaza
I don't think that we are. I don't think that we are. I think that you are tiptoeing around language, but we basically are describing the same set of events. I'm just calling it something very specific. But my point was that is not something that even in America's political landscape, even within their Democratic Party, that you're going to find a lot of people saying. So that's not, I think that these terms are ultimately not that very useful today, conservative and liberal. I don't know what they mean anymore, because there was a very specific definition of conservatism that was beyond a small government, people staying out of your business, people not taking your money. That isn't real anymore. I mean, today's modern day Republican Party is a fan of mass incarceration, legislating what goes on in people's bedrooms, defining morality for an entire country of people. And today's modern day Republican Party, by and large, supports a potential presidential candidate. We'll see how proceedings go. That is openly contemptuous of our constitutional mores and what it means to be like a democratically elected leader of this country. So these two poles that used to exist of conservative and liberal have been stretched so out of whack by today's current political circumstances that I think to call yourself a Black conservative, you are hearkening back to a time where that word used to mean something.
Okay.
That's my take.
No, that's good. Let me see if I'm following you. First of all, I gave 3 reasons. I said I'm an economic liberal in the classical sense of that term. I said I'm a cultural conservative because I used to be kind of religious, and I said I'm a Black self-help, self-reliance conservative because my reading of the historical imperative facing African Americans at this moment is not one of looking for restoration and reparation and the relief from racism as much as it is one of looking for taking responsibility, personal development, family, social capital, things like that. And you said, well, wait a minute. First of all, you weren't that religious even when you were religious. I paraphrase. Secondly, you say, besides, you're kind of an iconoclast and you're kind of heterodox and, look, there's subtlety in your thinking, there's nuance in your thinking, and you don't know what conservatism really means anymore. It's kind of a stick-figured placard, the banner that people are waving. But if you scratch beneath the surface, there's nothing principled conservative about the modern Republican Party and all that kind of stuff. Did I get you right?
You got me right. That is what I said, summarized concisely.
Okay, so what about the Black Power male fist, anti-racism, systemic racism thing, which I reject. What about the identity politics stuff, which I reject? Do you think I'm off base on that?
I don't think you reject identity politics. I think you play a different brand. I mean, if you're calling yourself a conservative, you are embracing some sort of identity. I think people who are against identity politics are always being, by and large, disingenuous. All politics is identity politics. You're just choosing to identify yourself differently. But I also think that is a complicated conversation because we've sort of entered a place where, I definitely occupy a different space from you on that. I think the purpose of government in its ideal form would be to help protect minority classes from a majority class that perhaps does not recognize its disadvantages. But we've also come to, I think, a difficult space within the, you didn't name it by name, but in the Black Lives Matter movement, where there are, you continue to see, I think there is something complicated that happens to people who become famous for advocating for themselves or for a specific group, where they can sometimes be co-opted by that success. And then the narrative becomes about them and not about the people that they are trying to support or protect. There are continued controversies that have come out about people who have been enriching themselves through this movement. So I actually don't know what the best answer is. I don't think it is possible for people who are so far behind the starting line necessarily to pull themselves up by their bootstraps in a way that will catch themselves up and pull even with the people who are so far ahead of them. But then I also don't think that things are necessarily as dire as people on both sides of the aisle often describe them as. I'm thinking of, there were a couple months ago on your site, somebody who, I don't know if they work for you or was doing some sort of research about comparing the rate of Black doctors to Asian American doctors, sort of as what's going on with the African American community. Why can't they sort of catch up in the way that the Asian American community has? And they had done some numbers on the rate of doctors, African American doctors in 1911 versus 2011. And depending on how you interpreted the numbers, you could look at it a couple of different ways. They had said that back in 1911, the percentage of the American population that was African American was something like 14.3%, and the rate of doctors was 1.7%. And in the intervening 100 years, the amount of doctors had only increased by 3 or 4%. I can't remember the number exactly, from 4.7 to 5.7%. Meanwhile, the percentage of the African American population had dropped to 11.3% or something like that. I don't have the numbers exact, but they were saying this as a indication of our failure to become more of a part of the medical community, just because by pure percentage points, we'd only increase by 3 to 4%. But if you take that as a percentage of the population, the African American population overall, that's technically an increase of our proportion by 300%. It's going from having only less than 10% of what our representation should be based on our percentage of the population overall, to about 50% of that, which could be a sign of encouraging growth in that, depending on how you look at it. So I always have to say,
I'm not sure I know what your point is here.
My point is that it has to be, when you're looking at what a problem is, I think people both like to awfulize the situation and also maybe not say that it is as serious as it is. Because we're looking at two different things. We're looking at when Black Lives Matter is talking about its issues, it's usually talking about these individual interactions that people have with the police. And if you look at the numbers on that, I believe Roland Fryer, a good friend of yours at some point, said that it was not more likely to be a violent interaction with a Black person that was stopped by a police officer than when a white person was. But if you look at the number of interactions overall, there are far more interactions of Black people with police. So it's just maybe not more likely to happen in any individual interaction, but it's more likely to happen because there are more individual interactions.
Okay.
The point I'm making here is that numbers can be made to say anything that you want to say, but the truth
How does that
of the
relate to the conservatism question that we had been discussing earlier?
Well, you were talking about your position on Black Lives Matter and people being pulling them up by the bootstraps. I'm trying to just say, what is the problem that people are trying to pull themselves up by their bootstraps from?
And what do you think it is?
I think it is the fact that there are two different kinds of racism, and you were saying that systemic racism doesn't exist. If I'm describing your situation.
It's being overblown as a holistic account of what's going on, which I think is more interesting, nuanced, and complicated than simply pointing a finger at something, this mythic thing called systemic racism.
And I'm saying that I agree with you on that, I guess, at the end of the day. But I disagree with what the remedy has to be, because there are a complicated series of factors that I don't think individuals can solve by themselves. I think there need to be a combination of efforts, both people being more conscious about what their life choices are, but then there also need to be people like government programs that are helping with that. We currently have an issue that I know you used to be very passionate about 10 to 15 years ago, mass incarceration. And there are far more Black men in prison, a far higher proportion of Black men in prison than there are of any other group. And that is an issue. That's a problem that needs to be addressed. And that can't be addressed on an individual level. It's impossible. It's an impossible ask. And I'm very willing to say I don't know what the solution is. I'm just describing that I think a problem can't be solved by the people who are suffering the problem, not entirely.
Okay, well, let me try this on you. Somebody takes a gun, they get in a car, they ride down the street, and they fire the gun out the window. The bullet hits a kid sitting on his grandmother's lap, and the kid dies. I want to condemn the shooter. I want to say about the act that led to that kid's death, that was despicable. I want sanction. I want there to be consequences. I want a person to be aware of the fact that if they do something like that and they inflict that kind of harm on someone else, that they will pay a price for it. I think that is both a good thing from a point of view of public policy, but it's also a right, virtuous, and moral thing to do. I think leaders of the community who, like Al Sharpton or somebody, who put themselves forward as representatives of Black people, when this kind of behavior is common in some quarters of the Black community, that they deserve to be held accountable for whether or not they condemn these actions. And I think blaming the history of racism for the irresponsibility of that act is an intellectually, bankrupt way of looking at the problem of social morality.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead.
What's wrong with that speech?
And sidestep that straw man, because I'm not sure what that has to do with anything I just said. I'm also not sure if that accurately describes the positions of Reverend Al Sharpton or anybody else you're talking about. So I don't know how to address that, because obviously that's not wrong, but that's also not what I'm talking about.
Okay, you agree that that's not happening, and you agree with me it'd be a good thing if it did happen?
I'm saying I don't know what you're talking about. Like you
said individual actions. You said there's nothing that individuals can do, and I'm trying to specify something that individuals can do.
But you're talking about a hypothetical situation that obviously everyone would condemn. But I'm saying we also need to look deeper at what led to that person driving down the street, firing a gun out a window. These things don't happen in a vacuum.
My wife, Lawan, and I are watching, it's an old TV series called The Chi. I don't know if you ever watched it. It's about Chicago kids. And there's 6 or 7 seasons. It starts in like 2017 or something like that. And I'm just now tuning in. Anyway, I mention it in order to affirm the wisdom of what you just said, which is that there is a deeper context to these behaviors, which are contemptible in my opinion, but let me hold back on expressing my revulsion and acknowledge that the characters in this fictional account are embedded within a set of relationships which include economic opportunities and public policy and politics, but also include culture and circumstance and bad luck and the strategic imperatives of, if somebody is trying to kill me and I know that the cops are not going to stop them and there's going to be no accountability, I have a very powerful incentive to kill them first. If somebody kills somebody whom I love and I know that there's essentially zero chance that justice is going to be done in any conventional way, I have a very powerful incentive to take matters into my own hands. These are just statements about the structure of the strategic situation. And they create this kind of web of interrelations among these characters, which has this tragic dimension to it. You see the train wreck coming. You know that this kid is in this, it's embedded, the gangs, the brother of one of the characters is a gang leader and he's mentoring his younger brother to follow in his footsteps. They have weapons. 10-year-olds have weapons. 10-year-olds with pistols. You don't think anybody's going to get killed? Kind of thing like that. And I sat there watching that. I'm late to the game. I'm watching something that was first broadcast in 2018 or whatever, because I'm just starting to watch the 6-season series. So the filmmakers here have put their finger on something really important. The statistics don't come anywhere close to telling the full story about what's going on.
I mean, I think that's true. I'm not familiar with that show. Obviously, the example that comes to my mind is a little more classic. I think about season 4 of The Wire. That's about those kids that are in school and how they are, slowly, inexorably drawn into a gang conflict and have no resources to turn to. Nobody is able to help them in school that in any meaningful way that is able to protect them from becoming a part of this life, and either it consuming them or diverting them from a path that would have led them to more meaningful and productive choices. So, obviously you want to condemn the person who's driving down the street and is this hypothetical person that you're very angry at, shooting their gun out of window and hitting a child in their grandmother's lap. But what you want to ask yourself is, how do you stop the person from getting that gun, wanting to shoot it in the first place? Because it's not a matter of shaking your finger at them and saying, make better choices. That obviously isn't working. It's easy to do. And it feels good to people to do it, to have more clarity on your position and why you're better than the people who have made poorer choices, or I'd rather phrase it, have had poorer choices available to them to make. It's a matter of odds at the end of the day. If there are a group of people who only have a certain valence of choices available to them, and some of them are good, but the vast majority of them lead them down a path where there are only going to be poorer and poorer choices available to them. You want to say, well, obviously we should teach them to make the better choices, but this is a numbers game and people are flawed. And we shouldn't act like we aren't living in a world where this is true. I myself have been very blessed to make poor choices that have had little effect on me because my father and my mother were in positions to afford for me to make those poor choices. Had I not been in a situation where my father and my mother had put themselves in a position where I could afford to make those choices, who knows what kind of person I would be. So as someone who's had privilege to fail a number of times and to still be here and to still own my own house, be in a long-term relationship with my partner, and not have had to be ever faced in a conflict with the police or drawn into some sort of legal ring of choices that would have gotten me caught up in a legal situation. I'm very conscious of the fact that it's not because I'm better or that I made better choices. It's
Well,
because
you
I
did
had a long way to fall before I had to.
Excuse me for interrupting. I was just going to say, at the end of the day, though, shouldn't we be able to say that you did make better choices, even if you did so under the beneficial influence of things over which you had no control? And it leads me to two questions. One is the imperative of judgment. Is there really a necessity to judge, even if you recognize that people are not entirely responsible? And the second is about responsibility. The absence of good choices leaves you not responsible for the ones that you make. Were they really the only ones? Not everybody in the same factual circumstance made the same bad choices. Don't we have warrant to hold people responsible when they do terribly destructive things?
I'm not saying that we don't hold them responsible. I'm just saying that that is not productive necessarily. Like at the end of the day, sure, people are responsible for their choices, but we also need to look at how do we get it so that there, because you're saying yes, there always is a way out. But I'm also trying to be realistic about what people are going to do when there are two roads available to them, and one of them is easier to pick than the other, even if it is necessarily more destructive. You are asking for what I think is an unrealistic situation that we expect people the bulk of the time to make the more difficult choice.
Okay.
I don't, and to turn this to another thing, I just don't
Yeah,
think that's realistic. I mean, let's look at your own life.
I was about to prompt you in that direction by saying we've talked about the Black conservative. The subtitle of the book, Late Admissions, is Confessions of a Black Conservative. We talked about the Black conservative, but we haven't talked about the confessions. So let's look at my own life. What's your point?
Well, your own life. We're talking about we expect people to make better choices. I think that is an interesting position to take for a man who wrote a book wherein he describes in detail constantly cheating on his romantic partners, doing hard drugs in the basement of his workplace. And only through the dint of failing time and time and time again, making the easier choice over and over and over again, having gotten yourself to a place of privilege where you're insulated necessarily from the worst possible consequences of those choices, that you eventually pulled yourself through because you were given so many chances to do so. It would be very easy for people to read this book and to judge you. And I'm sure a number of people have. I know you were warned by people not to publish this book because of that judgment. But I think the lesson that could be taken from that, from somebody like me who's reading the book, is yes, you know, you got through it, but only because you were lucky, only because you were blessed to have a very, very, very forgiving spouse. The hero of the book, I'm going to say,
Your
my
mother.
mom. Yeah, obviously, not to put too fine a point on it. But we're talking about an abstract that people are going to far more likely going to make the easier choice. They have the temptation of a beautiful woman in front of them, and they're married, and they have kids at home. And that doesn't necessarily stop them from making the easy choice. I cede the floor to
Okay.
the choice maker.
Well, we're into very fruitful territory here, very fertile territory, it seems to me. Although it's gotten personal, and that's not as comfortable as it might be. But, well, I
You
did put
released
it
the
all out
memoir,
there.
Dad.
I did put it all out there. Yeah, that's what Stephen Dubner, the guy the host at the Freakonomics Radio who interviewed me about the book, you know, he made an observation about one of my peccadillos. And I said, "Oh, man, Stephen, did you have to tell him about that?" He said, you put it in the book. That's where I learned about it. But what I wanted to say was, yes, and I try to grapple a little bit in the book with this juxtaposition, this contrast between my own crooked path in life on the one hand, and my prescription, my school marmish scold my self-righteous, exhortation to live decently to a political community that is oppressed and marginalized and that's beset with all manner of problems, uh, for which there is at least some relief to be had through public and political action. But that's not what I'm advocating. I'm advocating self-help. I'm advocating bootstrap. And isn't that a problem? Isn't that hypocrisy?
Yes.
And I have to acknowledge that there's a certain degree of hypocrisy. And then I have to say, though, that, we're all sinners in the classic Christian narrative, or, we're all human beings subject to all these kinds of forces of temptation and whatnot. Different religious traditions have different metaphorical representations of this classic problem uh, of, uh, of the human condition, and that I am embedded within the human condition and susceptible to these foibles, temptations, and flaws doesn't make me either incapable of engaging with the larger moral questions or necessarily wrong about them, even if my prescription contradicts with my own behavior. So
Do as I
I,
say, not as I do.
well, as I do is one thing to be dealt with on its own terms. As I say is not refuted by the fact that I don't do as I say. My not doing as I say is a statement about me, not about what I say. What I say could be right, even though I don't follow the script of what it is that I'm saying.
But isn't what you do a more accurate description of what it is to be human than what you say? Isn't the example of your life a more compelling, it's more compelling evidence about human frailty than the statements about what you believe people should do? Because it's very easy to say what you think people should do or how they should act. But I think how you act, and then you're just one person, it's not going to determine how individuals act overall. But it is, I think, a useful example. I mean, your life story in and of itself, it's a series of hills, climbing and descending, going up and down, coming so close to the mountaintop and throwing yourself off. And it would be easy for people to judge you and say, well, why would you do that? You were so close. Why did you fuck things up for yourself? I'm sorry, can I swear here?
Yeah.
Okay. And
Not
the lesson would be,
gratuitously. I was going to say not gratuitously, but it was entirely appropriate in the context.
and I think it's easy for people to judge you for doing so. I know I did. But as you become an adult, you realize that the people that raised you had no choice but to be who they were, and to be angry at them for that and to judge them for that is the easy choice. It's easy to shake your finger at somebody and say that you should have made better choices. You should have been better. But nobody can be but what they are. And who you are is both a brilliant mind that was, I think, helplessly bound by its own frailties and insecurities to make poor choices. And it took a long time to overcome that. And you were fortunate to have the opportunity to have that time. Most people are not that lucky.
Yeah. I wanted to just say, without in any way trying to rebut what you've just said, which I think is absolutely correct. I wanted to say that it's a long life, and the privilege extends, in my case, to being granted time to reflect. And Late Admissions, my memoir, is the fruit of a decade's worth of reflection. maybe even more. And that process of honestly, candidly, self-critically engaging in the reflection, while it can't cancel the error, might have some redeeming feature to it. Certainly, that's my hope. I mean, and this will be a little flattering. I wonder what you think about this. That in telling it and laying it all out, I mean, people have asked me, why would you be so candid? Why would you tell that? Why would you tell that? And you come off not looking so great here. You come off not being such a likable person here and whatnot. And I want to say, well, as they used to say when I was going to church, God's not finished with me yet, which is to say, it's an unfolding account here. And with the benefit of living into my eighth decade, and having survived stuff that would have taken a lot of people out and probably should have taken me out, certainly by the grace of whomever, by God or the loving wife who stuck by me, your mother, or just good fortune, friends, a socioeconomic location that allowed me, the benefits of good insurance policies and client and cooperative employers, and gave second chance, third chance. But here I am, and I can tell the account. I can tell the account honestly, and I can peel back the different layers of self-justification. And can I not contribute to the greater good in this way, even as I exhibit warts and all the circumstances under which I fail to fully live up to what it is that I would nevertheless want to affirm to be righteous and dignified living. I don't know. That's my gambit. That's what I'm hoping a sympathetic reader, my son, will come away from this book with.
So let me answer your question by reflecting on my childhood a little bit. I remember growing up, meeting fans of yours or colleagues or students or people who just knew who you were out in the world when I was a young adult, going to college with your name. Inevitably people would say, "Oh, are you related to the Glenn Loury?" Which was frustrating for me. In answering that question honestly, I think sometimes I would, sometimes I wouldn't. I often took people by surprise because I think people universally expect me to say, "Oh, it was great." And I think it would be fair to say, and I don't think you would disagree with me characterizing our relationship in my teenage and adolescent years as challenged.
No, I wouldn't.
There was a lot of
that.
conflict.
Right.
There was a lot of antagonism both ways. Because I think you put on a good show. I think you present yourself very well to people who don't know you. And I think that's part of why this book took a lot of people by surprise. The Glenn Cartman Lourys Sr., who raised me, could not have written this book. He would not have been capable of the self-reflection, the honesty, or the vulnerability that was necessary to write this book. So I am proud of the man that you've become. Not everybody grows. Even people who live long enough to have the opportunity to do so, many of them don't change. And you have. And so reading this book, it was an interesting experience for me. I found myself getting angry at somebody who I don't really think exists anymore.
Wow.
And, I've gone to therapy for a lot of my life. And one of the things that I had to learn is that there's no anger is an emotion, and it's legitimate, and you have to feel it and you have to process it. But it's also not something that's necessarily useful to hang on to, because for a lot of my life, I'm like, well, he's never going to understand why. And And if he's never going to understand why, you have to just process it yourself and then deal with that and be okay with it. And I have come to an unexpected place where you have done this work of self-confession that I think has caused you to sort of maybe face a lot of things that this wasn't an easy book to write. It wasn't an easy book to read, but it must have been a much harder book to write uh, because you're going through your past and you are naming you're not a Catholic, but this is you basically going into the confession booth, except the whole world is your priest and listing out all of your sins. And I do think there's a value in that. Maybe just for me. We'll see how we'll see how the American public consumes it. But I think there's a value in showing people that success is not what makes you happy or fulfilled. What is success? Like, I don't think you knew what that was when you were coming up as a young man, when you were trying to define yourself politically. I don't think you knew what you wanted. I think you had a gift. I think it opened some doors for you. And I think when you got through those doors, you weren't happy that people weren't as happy to see you as you thought they should be. And that you made some choices in reaction to that defined you in ways that you weren't expecting. And so you had to recalculate and recalibrate, and you made mistakes. But you kept trying. And that's sort of a reflection of not just who you are personally, but politically. To go back to the conservatives, like, you made mistakes. You have positions that I don't believe in, but you keep listening. And I think that only happens that if underneath those mistakes, those poor choices, those scars that you suffered emotionally, that there is a beating heart that really just is looking for people to love him that in the way that he thinks that he should be loved. Um, and maybe didn't necessarily get that in the way that he was looking for when he was younger. And as somebody who knows what that's like, I empathize as an adult with that man.
Well, that's very moving, Glenn. That really warms my heart to hear. And I want to say to all the world that I love you. My son, Glenn Carmen Loury II, born January 3rd, 1989. Maybe I shouldn't have told that. I'm sorry. I
That's all
revealed
right.
your age. And what a
40
joyous
years
day
less
that
than yours.
was.
I'm not complaining.
And his mother, Dr. Linda Datcher Lowry, my wife of 28 years, my best friend of 37 years. And it's just wonderful to hear. And it makes me wish that I could have ever had such a conversation with my father, who died in September of 2018. And we were talking about this before we started recording. It just so happened that the last time you talked with me for the Glenn Show,
Yes.
we were recording that conversation when news came to me via a telephone call from my sister that my father had expired. And you learned of it as I was learning of it, literally within the moment of that phone call, which interrupted our conversation.
Yes.
It happened that I was in France on a academic sabbatical, and so we were talking by Skype. But yeah, and I wondered if you wanted to reflect a little bit about that, about my father, about that incident, and so on.
Yeah. Sure. Because that was the last time we were on the show together, I believe. It's sort of specifically because of, I think people, your audience, hello, everyone. It's very easy to. I think they have an idea of who you are, and I've been on this program a few times, and maybe they have an idea of who I am. And you receive news that your grandfather has died, and you're probably expecting a reaction.
The audience is
The
expecting a
audience,
reaction.
I know, because at the time there was, and maybe nobody here that's listening to you now was listening then. Uh, there was criticism. I think people didn't think I was maybe warm enough to you in your moment of learning of your loss. And I don't know if there's any right way to react when you learn that somebody has died, particularly somebody who I think it's fair to say you had a difficult relationship with towards the end of their life.
I did.
That you did, and that I had no relationship with whatsoever towards the end of their life by their choice because of who I am. And,
Can I elaborate on that for the sake of the
you
audience who might
absolutely,
not know?
I know that might not be clear.
So, no, my son, Glenn, whom you're hearing from right now, is a gay man. He lives with his partner, Rob, in Massachusetts, and they've been together for over a decade. My father was not exactly delighted to learn that my son is a gay man, and he made that known in one way or another, and that constituted a irreparable breach in relations between my son and his grandfather. Separately, my father and I were on the outs at the time of his death for reasons that I could go into, but they are and remain to some degree a mystery to me. I think I gave offense to him in an interaction that we had during a visit that I made to him, raised my voice in opposition to something that he was saying, and I think he took deep offense at that. But I only speculate because it was never made explicit, but I can report that he would not allow me to come and visit him as he declined in his health and ultimately expired. So it had been some time, well over a year, maybe as many as 2 years that I had seen him before he died, and didn't have any communication with him. And his widow, my stepmother, Constance, basically didn't communicate with me at all about my father or, his honoring of his life or anything like that. It was just not a very pleasant situation. In any case, we're on a telephone call that is recorded for the Glenn Show because you and I were talking for the Glenn Show at that time. And the news came in that my father had died, and you responded the way you did, which some in the audience in the comments let it be known they thought was less emotionally supportive and empathetic than it might have been or perhaps should have been.
Yes. Yeah, that sums it up pretty correctly. And I don't know, maybe they were right. It is a difficult thing to contemplate losing one's father. I don't want to do it. I don't want it to happen to me. And I especially would not want it to happen to me if I was in a place with that man that we weren't talking. However, what I can say to that is that I know that will never happen to us. And I know that because we have been in some bad places. We have yelled at each other quite extensively for reasons that are probably not able to be succinctly described enough for the time they have remaining to us in this episode. But despite that, regardless of how profoundly, I don't know the word here, and I don't like not having the right word, but profoundly, whatever it is that our relationship has been or the conflicts that we've had, I've always known that if I called you, you would answer the phone. Maybe in part because you need to have people that love you, but you would always answer the phone. That's never been a doubt in my mind. If I needed help, you would always help. That's never been a doubt. So, all things considered, given what relationships between fathers and son can be, I can't really complain about mine. That seems like a pretty good one. Um, you know, comparatively, I have known people that don't talk to their fathers at all. I have, not to make this sensitive point, siblings that haven't had their relationship with their father. So I'm a lucky one. I'm Glenn too. You can't cut off the person you gave your name. um, and I don't know how that's going to come across, but it is true. Uh, I I don't know if we've always liked each other, but we've always loved each other. And I spent a lot of time, I think, being angry at you for things that were beyond your control. Um, and reading this memoir, this is going to be my endorsement now, was very helpful for me because it helped me understand you. Um, and I don't think I don't think a lot of people are capable of writing a book that gives people an unvarnished view of what they were feeling and what they were going through when they made some choices that would be impossible to understand from the outside. Um, I think that's actually a true accomplishment. I think you should be proud of that. That is so hard. Um, and I think that is the most remarkable thing about your book. People may be reading it looking for your accomplishments. I think if they're looking for that, they're going to be disappointed. But I think if they are trying to understand what somebody who has accomplished so much is going through when they seemingly are making choices that might throw it all away, that don't make sense, I think it helps people understand why people who have accomplished so much get in their own way. But what I think about a lot actually when reading this book is modern day reactions to scandals. How we often, people use cancel. I don't like the word. I don't think cancel culture is real, but how people's lives and careers are ended by foibles when they are made public. I wonder what would have happened to you if you had been coming along in this time. I think it could have been would have been a different story. It would have been a worse story. Um, I think this book, people might read it and get angry at your mistakes, but I think it should be an encouragement to give people grace. You have to allow somebody to push through the worst parts of themselves.
I heard something on, I mentioned this television show, The Shy, which I'm watching years after it was initially produced. I heard something in an episode that really stuck with me, and I was reminded of it just now as you spoke about your siblings. I should explain to the audience that you have 4 siblings, a brother Nehemiah, whose mother is also your mother, the late, great Linda Datcher Lowery, and 3 siblings who are in their 50s, considerably older than you, Lisa and Tamara, whose mother Charlene and I were married in 1969, and who were my first 2 children, and Alden, my son, my firstborn son, whose mother Janice Brazan has passed away, um, to whom I was never married, but he's 1 year younger than Tamara, who is 1 year younger than Lisa. And what I heard on the TV show that really stuck with me happened. This is a father and son. And the son is a kid who's in his late teens or early 20s, and he's homeless. Long story. shows up at his father's doorstep unannounced and asks to be taken in, and the father takes him in, but the father's living with another woman and mother, children, and the father has a complicated life. And there's a confrontation where the young man says to his father, "Where the fuck were you when I was growing up?" Because the household that the father is maintaining now is wholesome. Young kids sitting around the table, wife to whom he's faithful. Everybody's laughing. Bounty, food everywhere, nice house, a life. He's a real father. But for the young man in question, he was a father in absence who had abandoned his mother, who had dogged her out, who had gone off with another woman, who was having babies outside of the home, who was, a vagrant. And the father's answer was, "I'm sorry, son. Your mother got the boy. These people got the man." In other words, as he matured, he became a better person. He became more responsible. He came to understand what was really important in life. He came to realize that his way of living, the profligate, irresponsible way in which he had been living, was destructive not only of his own happiness, but of the potential for happiness of those who depended on him. And he became a better man. And I'd like to think that something like that is true of your father.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Okay, well, we're getting near the end of the hour here. Let me ask you a sensitive question. You're a gay man.
That's true.
Your father is not.
So it would appear.
That's a theme between the lines. I asked the reader to read between the lines because I'm writing between the lines. That's definitely a theme between the lines in this text. I hope you picked up on
it. Which one are we talking about now? Let's make it.
We're talking about your sexuality, my sexuality, and my feelings, my father's feelings. We had been talking about your sexuality, about the extent to which, I'm going to be explicit now, you were confident in me, accepting you for who you are in the fullness of all of that, and doubts that you may have had about that along the way, and whether or not the book played any role in dispelling those doubts.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I didn't have, by the time the book was written, I think all the doubts had been dispelled. I also think that this was a period of growth for you, because when I first came out of the closet, I remember you asking me the question, "Are you sure?" And I remember my response very clearly. I said, "Dad, by the time you were the age I was when I came out of the closet to you, you'd had 2 children and a third was on the way. Were you sure?"
I didn't remember that. That's a good one, though.
That was a pretty good line. I was proud of it. I remember when I first started dating Rob and he was coming over to our house, there was some frustration with the parking situation. And I think in an emotional reaction to that, you said, your home wasn't a brothel. To which I said, Nehemiah's been bringing his girlfriends here, and the natural extent of what that would imply has been happening for years. Has there been any conversation with him about what that makes your house? So I don't think you were always the most sensitive to it, but did I think that it would be a problem that would break this relationship at any point? No. And I think over time, particularly as it's just been Rob that you've met the whole time. It's been 14 years. I think that makes it easier to see that a partnership is serious when it extends to more than a third of my life at this point. And even if it weren't, I don't think that would have broken us in any way. I don't think that now. When I was younger, did I have doubts? Sure. But I believe that they were not founded purely in that part of our relationship, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense, because it raises the question of where they were founded. And my relationship with your mother will undoubtedly figure prominently in that assessment.
Yeah, well, you didn't treat her very well.
I agree. And I say as much in the book, but
I think it's fair to say that she, because you talk about this relationship in the chai, they got the boy, and we got the man. I'm not sure my mom got that man either. Just given things that happened that are detailed in the book, which is available in stores now for purchase everywhere. Um, uh, but I also have to say that in a relationship, there are two people who are making choices, and you made your choices, and mom chose to stay because she loved you, despite all the hurt that came with that. And she is no longer here to speak for herself. So what we have left are her choices, and I choose to honor those. So all I'm going to say is that she deserved better, but she wanted you. So what else can you do about that?
well, okay, this is the raw, unvarnished edition of the Glenn Show with Glenn and Glenn reminiscing about his late mother, Linda, and about our lives together, which thankfully have hopefully many years yet to come. So I do urge you to go out and get your copy of Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative, because it's everything and more that has been previewed here in this conversation. And I'm especially grateful to Almighty God. I'll say it, Glenn. I know that pisses you off.
It doesn't piss me off. It just doesn't mean anything to me.
For the blessing that my relationship with you and your brother Nehemiah, your sister Lisa, your sister Tamara, and your brother Alden. But I say especially you and Nehemiah, who are the fruit of this relationship with Linda, who's no longer with us, and in your 30s now, and such fine young men. I'm grateful for the chance to try to make amends where I've fallen short, and to try to be an object lesson for others. And I'm grateful that you love your father. He loves you back.
I feel it. Now that we've gone to the sales portion of this podcast, I really do want to say again, it is a great memoir about a good man a flawed man who has become a good one, but who has done a lot of work on himself. And it is clear in the book, because people who have not done work on themselves cannot be honest about what they have done.
Thanks a lot, my son. If you go to Amazon.com and you look up Glenn Loury, you will find among the books there a couple of those written by my son Glenn, who is.
I'll have to scroll way down. There's so many by Glenn Loury the first, but eventually you get to mine.
So, in case you're curious and want to check out Invisible Funerals.
Mm-hmm.
These are short story collections.
Short story collections. I honestly can't remember the names myself. Love Letters and Elegies. That's another one.
Yeah, Love Letters and Elegies.
What Death Can Touch. Those are the three. Don't read any of the other ones. I think those are the best three.
Amazon.com, Glenn Loury. That's Loury. The second,
Loury.
he's a self-published author, and he's been our guest here at the Glenn Show. And I'm really proud of my son. So thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Love Letters and Elegies, Invisible Funerals, and What Death Can Touch.
It's the name of a poem.
If you detect a theme there, there's a theme there.
Death, yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I started writing after my mother died.
Yeah, 2011. All right, my son, signing off for now. Love you.
Love you too.